Vi ringrazio per questa gentile introduzione. Mi sarebbe piaciuto molto poter fare questo discorso in italiano, ma purtroppo non mi è possibile. Spero che mi perdonerete se mi rivolgo a voi in inglese. It's an immense honor and an exceptional privilege to have been invited to participate in this event. Sì.
Si sente?
Sì. Basare? Is this better? Yes? Okay, so thank you again. I'm thrilled to be here and to have been invited to participate in this event, particularly given its splendid context. I first visited the Ara Pacis as an architecture student 40 years ago when the altar was displayed in a modest building, somewhat discussed more than I expected it to be, known as La Teca del Morpurgo, so named for its architect. Thanks to Richard Meyer, the altar's teca is now much grander than it was back then, with plenty of room for events such as this one, a celebration both of Vitruvius himself and of the journal dedicated to Vitruvian studies being presented here today. I'm sure Vitruvius would find great satisfaction in being linked to a work, the Ara Pacis Augustae, which, like his own De Architectura, is an enduring monument to the emperor for whom he wrote. Before I go on, I'd like to take a moment to remember Joseph Rickwert, who died last October at the age of 98. Joseph was a mentor and a friend. Through his teaching and with his books, such as On Adam's House in Paradise, The Idea of a Town, and The Dancing Column, he, perhaps more than anyone in the last half-century, inspired a resurgence of interest in Vitruvius among architects in the English-speaking world, myself among them. I will miss him. He will be missed. And if you'll allow me to continue just a little longer on a personal note, I would like to recall my very first day as a student at the McGill University School of Architecture. I was 38 years old, meeting a group of 40 classmates, half my age, which alone made the day both memorable and more than a little daunting. Of the words of welcome the school's director addressed to the new students of the incoming class, what I remember most vividly is his admonition that as architects, we would continually be impelled to draw on every kind of knowledge we possessed, pushed to the very limits of our skill, comprehension, and beyond. I'm sure any practitioner can confirm this, as indeed, I need hardly add, did Vitruvius himself in the famous opening lines of his treatise. Quote, "The knowledge of the architect is furnished with many disciplines and various kinds of learning. Judiciously exercised, it demonstrates everything the other arts achieve." End quote. It seems to me that among the most useful of the many possible ways to approach De Architectura in its entirety, all of the 10 books and all of their 10 prefaces, is to recognize the work less as the perfect corpus Vitruvius repeatedly claims he wrote, than as an open-ended exegesis of this opening declaration concerning the range of knowledge on which he insists the architect's and his own authority rest. While having written the only work on architecture to have survived from classical antiquity obviously makes Vitruvius exceptionally important, so does his having written such an extraordinarily protean and complex work. The long and far from univocal history of Vitruvius' reception is ample evidence of these qualities, as indeed is the range of topics covered in the impressive number of thematic works published by the Centro Studi Vitruviani since its foundation by Paolo Clini in 2010, the many activities the Centro has sponsored, and the first 3 issues of the journal, Vitruvius, being presented here today. And today, in this uncertain first half of the 21st century, it's precisely the imperfection of this allegedly flawless corpus, its open-endedness, and the shape-shifting character of his text that makes Vitruvius a uniquely appropriate conduit for channeling a virtually unlimited range of questions and investigations concerning the knowledge of the architect and all that that entails. Vitruvius's De Architectura is about architecture. What I would like to draw attention to with this obviously rather fatuous observation is that not only does De Architectura concern an art that, as Vitruvius claims, demonstrates everything the other arts achieve, but also that it concerns an art inextricably bound up with the world in ways that other arts are not. Architecture is a fundamentally worldly discipline. I think it's important not to lose sight of this worldliness. To begin with, architecture is far more closely bound to the material world than any other art, to the world of brick, sand, lime, stone, timber, and all the other materials Vitruvius writes about in his second book. Water as well, of course, to which he devotes the whole of Book 8. To the entire natural world, as he repeatedly insists. And by making mnemonics the topic of Book 9, one of architecture's 3 constituent parts, a reflection of the cosmic phenomena as well. But among the many facets of architecture's worldliness, most fundamental of all, I would say, is its intimate connection to the human collective. Its connection, in other words, to politics. The emphasis on community, which informs the so-called primitive hut chapter that opens Vitruvius's book on materials, could not be more explicit. As Vitruvius tells it, the civilizing of hut builders in Gaul, Caria, Lusitania, Aquitania, and elsewhere, whose rudimentary construction methods he reviews in this chapter, is concomitant with their abandoning traditional ways of building and learning to build proper houses with foundations, tiled roofs, and walls made of brick or stone. Their cultural refinement culminates with mastery of what he calls the certain calculations of symmetries. Civil society, in sum, depends on building. Buildings are measurable evidence of civil society. Yet consideration of the early imperial context when Vitruvius wrote impels a rather less complacent view, which is to say, recognition of the inexorable realpolitik that underpins such ostensibly benign sentiments. When Vitruvius wrote, Gaul, Caria, Lusitania, and Aquitania were all recently annexed Roman provinces, in whose annexation, Gaul at least, Vitruvius had actively participated as an artillery officer in Julius Caesar's army. Moreover, the brick and stone houses, which would eventually testify to his uncouth hut builder's attainment of the civilized state, are houses built the way Romans built them. For Vitruvius, a sustaining member of Rome's culture of conquest, buildings, the measure literally of Romanitas, were to be proof of Roman rule. Concerning this, his address to Caesar's heir in his first preface is unequivocal. Quote, "When I realized," he writes, "that just as through you Rome was increased with provinces, so public buildings were to provide eminent guarantees for the majesty of empire, I decided not to hesitate and took the first opportunity to set out for you my writings on these matters." In frank acknowledgement of Vitruvian politics as my personal preoccupation, I would venture to suggest that among the many matters that make De Architectura foundational for the history of the profession, its role as an urtext on the relationship between architecture and power is of exceptional consequence. The importance of Vitruvius on this topic, both in his ancient Roman context and as an essential reference in later centuries, should not be underestimated. Since the publication of its first edition of 1486, De Architectura has never been out of print, a statistic that is no doubt the least ambiguous of the many yardsticks by which the vigor of the Vitruvian afterlife can be measured. There are, as André Tavares has shown in his recent so-called biography of the book, more editions of Vitruvius in print now than there have ever been, which alone is a testament to the work's enduring authority. Quote, "To possess a copy of Vitruvius, whether one reads it or not," Tavares writes, "is to possess an idea evocative of architecture's cultural background, its long-standing sources, and of the value of order and proportion." Publication statistics notwithstanding, I think most would agree that the Renaissance, particularly in Italy, marked something like the zenith of Vitruvius's posthumous fame. With enthusiasm for his treatise directly proportional to enthusiasm for the revival of ancient Roman grandeur. De Architectura, it was thought, would at last explain the mystery of Roman ruins and provide an unimpeachable guide for building the way Romans built, a guide for rebuilding imperial Rome itself, as Raphael famously proposed to Pope Leo X in a letter of 1514. That the ambiguities, complexities, and obscurities of Vitruvius' text constantly sabotaged attempts to achieve such aims is well known. The work of Trattatisti, beginning with Alberti, was meant, among other things, to countervail such inadequacies. The search for clarity, as chronicled 40 years ago by Pier Nicola Pagliari in his article Vitruvio da testo a canone, involved an increasingly reductive winnowing process that in the end salvaged little of the original text, save easily applied rules. Yet throughout the entire process, Vitruvius's authority remained unchallenged, with rules for which he continued to be cited as a source referred to more often than not as Vitruvian principles. Palladio was especially prone to credit Vitruvius with methods that were often his own, as Francesco Macorin demonstrated in a recent article. What I want to stress here is the persistence and ultimate unassailability of Vitruvius's authority, beginning with his own self-representation in the opening chapter of his treatise as the quintessentially well-educated architect whose knowledge arms him with auctoritas. Vitruvius, in one way or another, has never ceased to be authoritative. As a guide for the recovery of Roman grandeur, or as an endorsement for methods that often had little to do with his, or even as the author of a copy of De Architectura translated into Mandarin, never read, on a shelf in the office of a Chinese architect in Beijing, and in countless other ways as well, Vitruvius has been and ever continues to be an authority. On that point, there's no escaping mention of Leonardo da Vinci, who has done more in recent times to focus attention on Vitruvius than on any of the Trattatisti or anyone else for that matter. Ever since the mid-20th century, when Leonardo's previously little-known proportional study of about 1490 suddenly became famous as Vitruvian Man, its author has come to play an uncommonly prominent role in studies of De Architectura, notably of Book 3, Chapter 1, with its Homo Bene Figuratus, a much favored topic. This, the world's most famous drawing, as Toby Lester called it in his book on the subject, has been Vitruvius's ticket to membership in today's celebrity culture. But truth to tell, it makes me a little uneasy to see Vitruvius riding on Leonardo's coattails. I have made the study of Vitruvius my turf for several decades now. It's therefore inevitable, I expect, that in the course of such long involvement, my relationship with him has veered slightly from the purely academic towards an oddly personal, even proprietary kind of attachment. It's embarrassing to admit how absurdly jealous I've become. Jealous not only of Leonardo for upstaging his Roman predecessor, jealous also of Alberti, for instance, whose ungracious pronouncements concerning De Architectura continue even now to be cited knowingly in disparagement of Vitruvius's credentials. I took it as a personal slight to Vitruvius's reputation when the journal Albertiana began publication in 1998. Another irritant, I'm ashamed to say, has been the existence of the Centro Internazionale di Studi di Architettura Andrea Palladio and the publication since 1989 of its journal Annali di Architettura. I freely admit that such resentment is not only misplaced, but entirely unreasonable, and in no way reflects the obvious importance of the Centro Palladio and its publications, or of the quality of the journal Albertiana. Moreover, the built works that survive to testify to Alberti's and Palladio's importance as practicing architects weigh heavily in their favor against Vitruvius's built legacy of a single building, which survives, as far as we know, or until now at least, only in his description of it. Nevertheless, reluctant as he was to admit it, Alberti was Vitruvius's disciple, as indeed was Palladio, who, unlike Alberti, made his discipleship a badge of honor. Where did that leave their master, who, after all, came first? Vitruvius was being sidelined, it seemed to me, unfairly preempted by his followers. That, happily, has ceased to be the case, which of course is why we're all here today. The master himself has been the origin and focus of operations at the Centro Studi Vitruviani since its foundation 15 years ago. Located at Fano, site of Vitruvius's famous basilica, its many activities, as others have already mentioned, include the publication of more than 10 books, the sponsorship of various seminars and conferences, and since 2022, a summer school addressing a range of thematic topics, with one this summer devoted to public space. Among the many undertakings particularly noteworthy is the Centro's journal, Vitruvius, which began publication 3 years ago, and now a new and entirely unique forum for recent research on all matters pertaining to its namesake. In just 3 issues, the range of topics addressed, both geographically and historically, as Professor Ortolani has outlined already, is a tribute to the protean nature of its complex subject. Its list of contributing authors includes a who's who of the most respected Vitruvius scholars, as well as relative newcomers. Particularly striking is how current the journal is in matters of Vitruvian scholarship, especially in reporting the advances in the ongoing archaeological quest for evidence of Vitruvius's ever-elusive basilica. And anyone working on Vitruvius today is bound to be profoundly grateful for its regularly updated bibliography of recent publications. As a way of highlighting the extent of this important new journal's reach, I will conclude by mentioning just two of its many fresh and stimulating contributions, both from the latest issue of 2024. The first, by the eminent Vitruvian Pierre Gros, is an important revision of Vitruvius's appropriation of architectural terms in the agenda that shaped it. The other is an article by Victor Plath-Tschudi, demonstrating the extent to which De Architectura was a source for the Norwegian architect Christian Norberg Schultz's work on the notion of what we call in English genius loci. I imagine you pronounce it differently. Genius loci, or spirit of place, whose impact on architectural theory in professional schools when I was a student was considerable. Two very different essays, one in French, the other in English, both equally at home in an Italian publication where the presiding genius is Vitruvius himself. Thank you. Grazie per la vostra attenzione.